All right, we might get started. I recognise it's a cold and dreary evening, and I thank you for coming out. Good evening and welcome to the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. I welcome all of you here tonight, actually. We've got dignitaries, officials, commentators, hopefully a journalist or two, members of the public, students. I think that this particular topic has very wide appeal. Thank you as well to those who are joining us online. Now, one of the important functions that ASPI plays is to convene conversations, to bring different communities and schools of thought together, engage with a range of alternative views. So we really are pleased to have you all with us tonight, and I do remind you that there is an opportunity for questions later, and we very much appreciate you getting involved in the conversation. We are always very pleased to host Ambassador Yamagami. He's such a close friend to Australia. He's a deeply admired and respected friend and partner to all of us here at ASPI. Tonight, the Ambassador will provide some opening remarks. He'll be followed by Dr. Thomas Wilkins, Senior Fellow at ASPI, affiliated with our office in Washington, DC, which was only just opened last week by the Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Miles. And he's the author of the report that we're here talking about tonight. Congratulations, Tom, on a terrific contribution on an important topic. We'll then be joined for a broader conversation by Professor Rikki Kersten from Australian National University. Now, Professor Kersten is an expert on modern Japanese history, and she's focused extensively on foreign policy, security policy, the US-Japan alliance, and Australia-Japan relations. So we couldn't have a better person to help us have a good dig into this topic tonight. Now, just before I invite the Ambassador to the stage, I do want to acknowledge the tragic loss in shocking circumstances of former Prime Minister Abe. Without his leadership, vision and commitment, we would likely not be having the conversation that we are about to tonight. Ambassador, the podium is yours.
Well, thank you, Beck, for your kind introduction. Dr. Thomas Wilkins, Professor Rikki Kersten, distinguished ASPI Fellows, members of the online audience, ladies and gentlemen. I am delighted to join you all this evening for this launch event for the ASPI report, Japan's Security Strategy. I should at the very outset congratulate both Tom and Rikki for their fantastic work, highlighting this important area both for an Australian audience and for the broader international community. I should also thank ASPI for the invitation to address you this evening. I am beginning to become quite a regular around the ASPI premises. Perhaps I should open my own branch office here. It is true to say that this subject matter is very, very close to my heart. As a diplomat and a national security professional, I have spent the best part of my career examining how Japan can better defend itself against external and internal challenges, and I hope to share a little bit of that insight and experience with you this evening. Like most countries across the Indo-Pacific region, Japan has witnessed an increasingly severe security situation, partly as a result of the emergence of a new and more belligerent regional power coupled with events in Europe. With its long-standing defense and security relationship with the United States, quite a few Japanese spent many decades in a relatively benign state of awareness about its security and the threats beyond its borders. With its prime geographical and strategic location housing the forces of the world's most dominant military power. The security arrangement initially forged between John Foster Dulles and Yoshida Shigeru ensured that Japan could primarily concentrate on economic recovery and growth following the devastation of World War II, while providing the United States Japanese bases, not only for the defense of Japan, but also for peace and security of the Far East. In time, the strength of the Japanese economy would return it to the forefront of the international stage, in turn supporting the economic development of many countries around the region and the globe, including Australia's. In that regard, Japan and Australia have grown together. On that point, even a number of Chinese intellectuals have privately admitted that without a massive amount of economic assistance, robust investment, and technological transfer from Japan, the Chinese economy could not have grown so large so quickly. Yet the legacy of the war years, which led to the loss of 3.1 million Japanese lives, still lingered deep within the national psyche of the Japanese. Having been brought to the edge of the abyss, there was a strong, almost a visceral reluctance to become engaged in any activity that might resemble a proactive defense stance. My own personal experience reminds me that it was only after intense scrutiny of aims and lengthy constitutional legal arguments in the Japanese Diet that Japan's first peacekeepers were able to be deployed to Cambodia in 1990, where they worked in tandem with the ADF, as well as deploying SDF assets to the Middle East following the first Gulf War in 1991. This relatively ambivalent state of affairs continued until around 2012, when it was announced that Japan would undertake a force posture shift in response to the growing challenge to Japan's sovereignty and territorial integrity over the Senkaku Islands by a rising and increasingly assertive China. In the years since then, the continuing threat posed by nuclear and missile development programs of DPRK, North Korea, combined with the attempts by China and Russia to challenge the status quo and undermine the rule of law, have accelerated a shift in Japan's collective mindset towards adopting an active, dynamic national security doctrine. Some might say that what was once considered a glacial change in mindset has, in relative terms, jumped to light speed in the wake of Russia's egregious and brutal invasion of Ukraine. That change is borne out by polls of public opinion towards providing defense equipment to Ukraine and adopting more proactive activities abroad. In an NHK poll conducted in May this year, 55% of respondents said they agreed with Japan possessing counter-strike capabilities, while 52% agreed that Japan should increase its level of defense spending. On the subject of constitutional revision, attitudes are also changing. In a Yomiuri Shimbun poll held in this month, 58% of respondents are anticipating debate on constitutional revision to take place in the Diet. This remarkable change in mindset has been reflected in government policy. The Kishida government has already agreed to a substantial increase in the defense budget and to fundamentally reinforce Japan's defense capabilities. In a major break with the past, the Kishida government also agreed to provide non-lethal defense equipment such as drones, bulletproof vests, emergency rations, helmets, and medical supplies to Ukraine in March this year to aid in Ukrainians' defense against Russia's invasion. What has happened to Ukraine has come as a stark reminder of how deterrence must be used to defend the national interest and uphold territorial integrity, sovereignty, and the rule of law. Japan's past is replete with examples of the need to use its latent strength in arms to defend itself, to practice what is known in Japanese as jiriki kyusai, or self-help. With the perils of proximity impacting on Japan's well-being, an increase in defense spending is a natural outcome, which most of the Japanese populace accepts as a necessity. Yet Japan also knows that it cannot ensure its security by force of arms alone. It has presented an ambitious vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific, in which each and every member enjoys security and prosperity. It revived and has been a driving force in promoting the Quad, the leaders' meeting of which recently took place in Tokyo, and where new initiatives in maritime domain awareness, climate change, HADR, cyber, space, and infrastructure were announced. Partners are also a necessity in this new strategic reality. And Japan has been blessed by the strong support Australia has shown in building defense ties with us over the past decade, which recently culminated in the Reciprocal Access Agreement. This is the first such agreement that Japan has signed with any country, and is a mark of the respect and trust in which we hold our special strategic partner, Australia. With the RAA's conclusion, expectations are that our bilateral defense relationship will become a lot more active, with a concurrent increase in exercise activity. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is just a glimpse into what changes are taking place in Japan's strategic thinking. We are making a much larger, much more dynamic, and much more ambitious contribution to regional and global security than at any time in the post-war period. Some might say that every change in Japan's national security position occurs incrementally. But let me point out that when change comes, it is permanent and irreversible. How our security strategy might evolve from here are obviously arguments that Tom and Rikki are well qualified to examine. And I encourage everyone in the audience and watching online to read the report and draw your conclusions from it. At a time when the world stands at a precipice between protecting the rule of law or submitting to the law of the jungle, Japan is actively working to keep the beast at bay with the help of like-minded and law-abiding residents of the global village. Thank you very much.
In a second. Yeah, thank you. Ambassador, thank you. What a wonderful framing. Terrific to hear that authentic voice. You always offer a personal perspective as well as the official Japanese government perspective. So important to hear. Tom, without further ado, can I invite you to the podium? And Rikki, would you like to come up to the stage?
Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attendance. I would also like to thank ASPI for their support in this project, and our esteemed panelists, His Excellency Ambassador Yamagami, a very hard act to follow, and Professor Rikki Kersten, and our moderator, Shrimpton. Before commencing, I would like to pay tribute to the late Prime Minister, Mr. Abe Shinzo, who did so much for his country and for Australia-Japan relations. He'll be sadly missed here, as well as in Japan and beyond. Indeed, Prime Minister Abe was absolutely central to the development of Japan's security strategy, which we will discuss today. And his influence and legacy remain crucial to this issue. It's fair to say that Japan has not faced such a challenging security environment since the height of the Cold War. Japanese speeches and documents consistently emphasize the refrain, increasingly severe security environment, to describe the country's predicament. Among Tokyo's most pressing concerns are China, North Korea, and the Russian Federation. Strategic rivalry, conventional and nuclear buildups, combined with advanced technological competition, all serve to quicken the pace at which security challenges will emerge. So, to the main three challenges. First, the People's Republic of China, since its economic and military rise to power, has increased its pressure on islets in the East China Sea that Japan identifies quite specifically as its inherent territory, but which Beijing disputes. Much of this pressure takes the form of grey zone operations, whereby Chinese air, naval vessels and maritime militias frequently approach or intrude into Japan's air defense identification zones or extended territorial or contiguous waters. Second, North Korea continues to expand and improve its nuclear and missile capabilities, engage in belligerent rhetoric, and shows no desire to respond to calls for denuclearization of the peninsula, even as it violates UN sanctions. Third, despite the ongoing war in Ukraine, Russia continues to actively pressure Japan's airspace through regular patrols around the Japanese archipelago and has beefed up its military deployments in the disputed northern territories. The level of cooperation between Moscow and Beijing through their no-limits strategic partnership has also found expression in combined air and naval exercises and patrols near Japanese territory, most recently in June of this year. As if strategic challenges were not overwhelming enough, so-called non-traditional security issues persist and all require attention, including economic security, especially the use of economic coercion, climate change, and the potential for natural disasters in Japan or across the region, to name but a sample. Clearly, such a perilous predicament requires a firm response to address such challenges. Over the past decade in particular, Tokyo has moved to squarely address the challenges it faces through advancing a well-crafted security strategy. This began with the first ever National Security Strategy document in 2013, which provides the context and direction for updates through the National Defense Programme guidelines, and which is measured and implemented through the Midterm Defense Programme. Many other activities in the form of supplementary legislation and agreements with allies and partners further complement the process to achieve steady and unified progress towards buttressing Japan's overall strategic posture. This all occurs in a highly coordinated and synergistic manner, as I point out in the report. There are three elements to Japan's security strategy that I elaborate in detail in the report. One, diplomacy through the free and open Indo-Pacific vision. Two, domestic mobilization of its security apparatus and defense forces. And three, the strengthening of alliances and partnerships, not least with Australia. First, as part of its proactive contribution to international peace, first enunciated under Prime Minister Abe, Japan followed up in 2016 with its vision for building a stable and prosperous regional order, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP. Indeed, the FOIP, which has subsequently been adopted or engaged with by the US, Australia, and ASEAN, stands out as a successful example of Tokyo's new entrepreneurship in regional order building. Second, Tokyo recognises that in order to support this vision, in tandem with allies, partners, and other willing states, as well as to safeguard its own national security, it must do more to realise its potential contribution as a regional security actor. To this purpose, Japan has reformed its national security apparatus, most notably with the establishment of a National Security Council, and legislated a peace and security package in 2016, which will allow it to do more to protect itself and allies and partners within its constitutional limits. Japan can now engage in collective defence with allies and partners in some very specific contingencies. Though Japan remains committed to an exclusively defensive military posture, it has sought to meet intensified regional challenges through the creation of a multi-domain defence force. This reflects recognition that Japan needs to enhance not only its traditional land, sea and air capabilities, but also address challenges in the new space, cyber and electromagnetic domains. Moreover, new and enhanced defensive capabilities are sought, including notably strike capabilities that can deter or respond to long-range threats. Thirdly, Japan realises that security challenges cannot be addressed by one country alone, and therefore has sought to strengthen its ties with its US ally, whilst at the same time building new security relationships, typically through the strategic partnership model. The latter includes partnerships with countries as diverse as India, the Philippines, Singapore, the UK, France, and not least Australia. Many of these new bilateral relationships also operate in the increasingly important range of minilateral configurations, such as the US-Japan-Australia Trilateral Strategic Dialogue, or TSD, and with the addition of India, the Quad. Of these new security arrangements, the Japan-Australia Special Strategic Partnership stands out as the exemplar. After an incremental start, the mold-breaking Joint Declaration on Security Cooperation of 2007 has since formed the basis for steady and accelerating bilateral security cooperation, with the relationship frequently described by officials as more important and stronger than ever. Drawing on a close alignment of shared strategic interests and mutual values, the Japan-Australia partnership is a valuable joint mechanism for diplomatic, security, defence, economic and military coordination to the benefit of both parties. In sum, Japan has steadily worked to craft a purposeful and multi-layered security strategy that will permit Tokyo to shape the regional order in line with its values and interests, enhance national and regional deterrence, and allow more seamless and efficient responses to regional contingencies. Much of the credit for this significant achievement should be accorded to the late Prime Minister Abe, who set in motion the restoration of Japan as a key contributor to regional security when he prophetically announced at the beginning of his second term that Japan is back. The developments I have highlighted today provide testament to this determined exhortation. Thank you kindly for your attention, and I look forward to the Q&A session.
Thank you very much, Tom. Now, I would like actually to invite you, Professor Kersten, please, to respond to what we've heard already from the Ambassador and from Dr. Wilkins before we launch into some questions.
Absolutely, and I'm thoroughly intimidated being flanked by these two gentlemen, and I will try and overcome my cowardice and ask some brave questions. Let me first say, when I started reading this report, Tom, and I saw that claim that not only is there a lot happening in Japanese security policy that is noteworthy, but you claimed that there was a new coherence and coordination between the different policy domains, so not just within defence, but foreign policy and arguably beyond. And I thought, really? But Tom lays it out for us, and it makes you go back and look at the core documents that have been produced in recent years and see them with new eyes. There is a coherence and a coordination. And thanks to you, I'm now looking for it when I'm reading documents, and I'm reading documents in a new way. I do think this is a significant development in terms of the Japanese policy environment, and it's a very valuable contribution you've made, alerting us to this. I was used to thinking in policy silos because it was always like that. It isn't anymore. And you're absolutely right about that. I think it's an important contribution. I also really admire the detail that you pour under each of your three main arguments. No one can argue this is not an evidence-based piece of work. So you've made my task in commentating and asking difficult questions even more difficult than it normally would be, but I'm going to give it a go, and some of it may not meet with your approval, Ambassador Yamagami. So I think there clearly remains a couple of constants in Japanese security policy and security strategy, some of which you address in passing, some not. One of them is the culture of self-constraint. Even former Prime Minister Abe, with his incredible policy ambition, had to buckle to reality and resort to the self-imposed constraint that attaches to every single Japanese security policy. It's hard to think of one that it doesn't attach to. And I wondered if you would comment on whether you think that culture of self-imposed constraint is going to remain a problem in the ambitious future that you've outlined for us in the development of Japan's actual capability as opposed to its aspirations for a multi-domain force, etc., etc. So that's one issue. The second one, and this is where you will not be happy with me, I think, Ambassador Yamagami, I think there clearly remains a gap between policy ambition and public opinion, and that this remains a tangible element in Japan. It partly explains the constant appearance of self-imposed constraints in the security policy realm. But it also shows itself in other ways, and it's going to show itself again, Tom, with the revised national security strategy and the subsequent NDPG and the midterm thing as well. Why? Because those three documents are going to be approved by cabinet resolution. They are not going to be debated in Parliament. There isn't going to be a scrap and a public show of debate and consultation. It is going to be a cabinet fiat. In other words, it is cutting off engagement with public debate. Now, is this because the government fears that there won't be a positive reception and that these things are so important that they need to go through and that they can build consensus afterwards? I don't know, but that is not going to help this perception of a democratic deficit in the increasing ambition in Japanese security strategy. And finally, one document that struck me as really important, taking the debate further, that I'm not sure you referred to in your report, was the Liberal Democratic Party's strategic policy paper, produced in April this year. It's quite a lengthy document, and the fascination of it for me is how it integrates the invasion of Ukraine into the development of Japanese security policy. In particular, what I found fascinating about it was not only did you see the integration and coherence with the FOIP, which is also mentioned in this report as an integral part, but it talked about the need for a structural and vital connection between East Asian entities and NATO. And the justifications for the policy ambition in Japan were justified according to NATO logic. For example, doubling of Japanese defence expenditure to 2%. Why? Because that's what NATO recommends. So this whole, the element of Ukraine and how that is being mobilised as part of the security strategy narrative is something I'd like to hear from you. And I really do recommend that report. It's very, very interesting. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, I think we actually have our first couple of questions ready to go there. So I would like, if you don't mind, both of you to perhaps respond to the questions that Professor Kersten has posed. Well, Ambassador, would you like to go?
Okay, well, thank you, Rikki, for your very, candid, views. And in order to sort of, invite more discussion in a robust manner, I would like to, return your candor with my version of candor.
Help.
And I think the reason I cited the numbers, specific numbers coming from opinion polls is just because, there was a sort of, diehard stereotype among, Western observers of Japanese politics that there is a, constant gap between policy initiatives and public opinion. And I just wanted to emphasize today in my, short speech is, public opinion is shifting. This is an important element, in order to look at what Japan stands at this current juncture in light of what's happening in the East China Sea, as well as what is transpiring in Ukraine. These big, turn of events are affecting Japanese, public, mindset. I think this is something, really important to understand. Quite often, Australian observers, experts on Japan, Western observers tend to, hear from English-speaking Japanese, but if you talk to, non-English speaking Japanese, they will be, ready to explain to you what's happening in Japan. I mean, just imagine if you keep on receiving, patrol votes of a neighboring country to, for example, Thursday Island, claiming Thursday Island does not belong to Australia. What will be the reaction of Australian public? This is exactly what's happening in Japanese media on a daily basis. And this egregious, brutal invasion of Ukraine is all over Japanese TV every day. And I think it's natural for us to see a very, very big shift in Japanese public opinion.
Thank you. So clearly a strong argument there that the gap is shrinking, I guess, Professor Kersten. Now over to you, Tom.
Yeah, thanks, Rikki. You did deliver up some nice, tricky questions as usual. Thanks. So, take the last one first about the LDP strategic policy paper. I will check that out. It's my I'm remiss in not having done that. I think probably just because of the report production line process.
Oh, I'm sure.
Process. But I think this idea that sort of the strategic environment and the dynamics that are occurring, sort of generated by authoritarian powers in both the European and the East Asian theatre, are sort of causing countries, like Japan, but also I'm thinking Britain as well, to take, a more composite view of the interaction between this. I mean, I looked a little bit at this before about how the same sort of methods, the sort of salami slicing, the hybrid warfare, the grey zone activities are being used by both of those authoritarian and sort of, more assertive powers in Europe and in East Asia. And, the fact that Japan is looking at the European theatre, seeing the warning signs, seeing a lot of the same conditions exist in Asia for similar sort of developments, it makes perfect sense. And then I think about my country of birth, the United Kingdom, and how they've are faced with the threat by Russia in Europe, but are then sending all of their naval assets out to the Indo-Pacific region as well. And so the connectivity and the mirroring between these two theatres, and the fact that the two sort of challenger powers straddle these two theatres and point in different directions, use the same methods and everything, I think is indicative of this. On the second point about the public opinion polls, I think that Yamagami-san sort of answered that quite fully, but that's also my impression as well, that the perception gap, that the Japanese public seem to be very much coming around to what were outlying kind of elite perceptions. And if you look at some of the polls for increased defence budget, acquisition of stronger capabilities and everything, they've really gone up from what I've seen. I haven't digested it in full, but I think that the indicators are in that direction. Now, about the first point, the culture of self constraint, these self-imposed restraints, there's a lot of these are still in position. I mean, it's very clear that Japan is committed to a exclusively defensive posture, but just sort of sitting there and waiting for things to happen, a very sort of reactive and responsive posture is not sufficient now, given the intensity and the new methods and speed at which challenges and threats might arise. So, over this period of kind of 10 years that the report really covers, you have seen a gradual some of these very, very firm constraints are still there about the Constitution, Article 9, and the 3 non-nuclear principles and everything. Those remain the core, and many others as well. But some of the ones around the margins, things like new developments in what Japan can do in terms of overseas defense technology transfers. That started in 2011. We also have a very specific agreement between Japan and Australia that allows for defense collaboration and transfers. Some of those things are loosening now. And one of the ways that I think Japan has been able to do this, and of course the peace and security legislation of 2016 and the provision for collective self-defense and so forth, these are all important steps forward in overcoming some of those restraints, within certain parameters. But the very last point is that I think one of the ways that Japan has been very good in reassuring others is that these aren't sort of very radical departures, but these are just very sensible and fairly sort of incremental, rational responses to a rapidly changing environment. It's to go along and do these things with others and within kind of bilateral, multilateral, lateral contexts, to provide that reassurance that Japan is not just going out there on its own, out on a limb, in a very sort of radical or unpredictable direction. So that provides a lot of reassurance, I think, doing those things, in larger fora.
Thank you, Tom. I think you touched on a really important point there at the end, and back to your initial comments, in a region and in a time where we're seeing a lack of constraint and an assertiveness and aggressiveness that alarms countries in the region to an extent. An element of constraint is appreciated, I think, by some in the region. So, Ambassador, I'd like to come back to you, if I may. You obviously have a very unique perspective, and I'd like you to draw on that for us, please. Talk about how you are seeing both Canberra and Tokyo driving the bilateral relationship forward. Where do you see some issues, and where do you particularly see perhaps the key opportunities? What are you looking for in success?
I think on the macro level, I think this year is going to be very important because we are now working hard for the this revision of joint declaration on security cooperation, which is as Tom explained in his remarks, it was issued in 2007, so 15 years ago. So the security situation facing both Australia and Japan have enormously changed. So we need to come up with new version of our joint declaration. And when Prime Minister Albanese went to Tokyo, I accompanied him when he had the first summit meeting with Japanese counterpart, Prime Minister Kishida. They agreed to have new joint declaration on our security cooperation. And we are working so that it can be in time for Prime Minister Kishida's visit to Australia. I hope it will take place sometime this year, by the end of this year. So this is going to be a very, very important opportunity. And on a micro level, I'm expecting to see more active and robust exchange of personnel coming back and forth between Australia and Japan in order to implement the newly signed reciprocal access agreement, which means we would like to welcome more ADF personnel to Japanese bases, and we would like to see more of Japanese self-defense forces personnel coming down to Australia, and this will certainly serve as a strong deterrence.
Excellent. Great, thank you. Continuing on that theme, Tom, I might just quickly come back to you, but I've got another one for you as well, Rikki. Relationships emerge as a really important theme in your report, Tom, and particularly for Japan. There's been a real focus on developing relationships. You described the Australia-Japan relationship as an exemplar, and you did give a few examples in your notes, but can you just really zero in for us, please, and explain why is it an exemplar, and what are some examples of what you're talking about there?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I do really think that this bilateral relationship between Australia and Japan really stands out as something qualitatively different from other relationships that Japan has built, other strategic partnerships, and Australia. These are moving up fast, but Australia was the first. It broke the mold. First example of Japan's stepping outside of exclusive security reliance upon the United States to initiate a significant security relationship with a third party. Now, I culled a quote from the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which defines the partnership with high praise. The Australia-Japan partnership is our closest and most mature in Asia, and is fundamentally important to both countries' strategic and economic interests. I think that captures it quite nicely, just the sense of priority that's put on that. And of course, our relationship is, there are many strategic partnerships, not all of which within the region, not all of which add up to much, but ours has the moniker special strategic partnership, which is, imbues it with something, a kind of a language that's much more familiarly familiarly used when we describe something like the UK-US relationship or the US-Israel special relationship. So that's very deliberate, it's diplomatic signaling. Now, as for me, why I think it's special as an analyst, apart from its official name, is the way that it was first, and it set the template that these other partnerships have followed. So, India was probably the sort of the second one to get, second cab to leave the rank, and actually, follow quite a similar pattern of building up the same kind of things like security declaration, eventually 2+2 meetings, this kind of thing. But there's others. The United Kingdom is, almost looks like it's mirroring the template that was built by the Australia-Japan relationship. A couple of other things I'll just say very quickly is one of the strengths that makes it special is it's multi-dimensional. It's a full spectrum relationship. Some of these strategic partnerships are quite narrow, or they're strategic partnerships on paper, and they claim this big agenda, and then you look at the concrete output and they've done very, very little. Now, this is something that really makes the Australia-Japan relationship stand out, is we actually get things done together, and our agreements are meaningful and cover a broad scope, even into sensitive areas like military exercises, information sharing, and so forth. And then the other thing is, again, there's so many of these strategic partnerships. Any bilateral or even multilateral relationship is going to have points of friction and everything. But the level of shared alignment in terms of values and interests, the extraordinary conformity between the strategic views of our countries behind the Indo-Pacific construct and the free and open Indo-Pacific. Often people, use this sort of casual phrase, but the closeness and our coherence on all of these issues really make the relationship a kind of marriage made in heaven.
Excellent answer. Thank you. Lots of substance behind the rhetoric, which is incredibly important. Rikki, I'm going to come back to you before a warning that I will be coming to you next, audience, for questions. There'll be a roving mic here, and those online, please submit your questions. You will have a chance to. But before we do that, you described some concerns, I guess, or some issues that might be barriers in the relationship, the self-imposed constraint, potentially public opinion. Can I ask you to flip that now and offer, with the benefit of your expertise and depth, what are the unique factors at play in Japan's context that propel us closer together, that do in fact put Japan on that more proactive footing? Or do you genuinely have doubts that that's where it's going?
No. I think the most astonishing thing about the positive trajectory of Australia-Japan security partnership is that it's trust-based. It's not utilitarian. We don't have a strong trading partner who we're trying to keep happy with a nice little security ribbon tied on top. This is a security partnership with a country with whom Japan was at war, whose people suffered at the hands of Japanese. And look how far we've come. That is the astonishing thing, I think, to look at this, that it's a genuine trust-based relationship. It has overcome a past that is tough to overcome. And I think Tom, you described it as, is it multi-dimensional, multi-domain? It's not just about trade. It's not just about security. It's political. It's cultural, and all these other things are enmeshed together. And the second thing I would point to as evidence at the strength of this trust base is that Japan and Australia increasingly are collaborative and cooperative in regional multilateral settings, that they come to the table with joint principles and values and objectives and work together in a multilateral setting to achieve a jointly desired outcome. Now, one example of that is defence aid in Southeast Asia, but there are many examples of this. So these are two things that I think are really worthy of mention.
Excellent. Great. Thank you very much for bringing those out. Now, do we have any questions in the audience? Please raise your hand. Don't be shy. Please, can we have a microphone down the front here?
Thank you. Peter McDermott, Japan, Australia Defence Scholar. The Australian Defence Force and the Japanese Self-Defence Forces operate with each other than their relationship with the United States in a way that they do with no other country. In other words, it is very important to both of them and they operate together militarily. We have seen since the 2007 Joint Declaration of Security Cooperation, and acts are put in place and updated a few times. We've seen an opportunity there for each country's military to operate in the other country's military. We are now talking about an update to the JDSC. Ambassador, I'm very pleased to hear that. Mm-hmm. What I'm suggesting is, as a realist and as a previous military planner, it seems that there's no sense in practicing interoperability, and there's pictures in your report there, Thomas, of this thing happening. We do not do this because we think it's a good idea. We do this because we think one day it may happen. Japan has moved through its process of collective self-defense denial and opened the door a little bit. It is very hard to find out what that little bit is, and the 15 examples that have been given by the government of Japan give you some indication. I have heard that Australia and Japan, that Japan talks about collective self-defense with another country, probably Australia. Tom, what do you think we Australia would be likely to be doing, and how far might Japan be prepared to go militarily if there were a reason to do so? And Ambassador, I'd be very grateful for your comments too. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Everything you point out is absolutely well taken on board. I think very valid points. Now, here's the soft answer to that. What can we do together? Well, we cooperate a lot on in terms of our interoperability, military exercises, joint training, staff exchanges, all this kind of thing, which is very, very useful for responding to non-traditional security challenges, such as humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, maritime issues, but also, you know, as you gradually sort of move beyond and segue from non-traditional security to sort of what some people call the harder stuff, the more strategic stuff, then, you know, working together to support one another in terms of joint maritime domain awareness, you know, perhaps monitoring better what some intrusive actors are up to within the sea space, either close to Japan or even Australia or Pacific Island countries or something. That's something that we could use our naval and air interoperability for, is surveillance. Now, of course, the toughest one and the most controversial one to speak about is regional contingency planning in case, you know, some kind of conflict or crisis breaks out. Now, those are discussions that I'm not privy to, but I guess that, all of these things that you described, the interoperability, the exchanges, and so forth, maybe standardization of some of our equipment might go some way to helping with that. All of those things are valuable experience that can be, put into practice should a more serious regional contingency arrive. But let's just, add the rider to this, that Australia and Japan are extremely unlikely to do anything by themselves together. This will almost certainly be in cooperation with the United States, and that's where we'll be taking our cues, and that's where the hard discussions will take place. Having talked to a lot of officials in DC and Japan about these things, there is a certain reticence to look at some of the most dangerous contingencies, but these are certainly something that need thought behind closed doors that I'm not able to access. So apologies, I can't give you a very, very firm answer on that, but I think it's a sort of a sliding spectrum of what we might do with the capability is that we're building together.
I think taking advantage of the question posed to me, I'd like to touch upon Rikki's point to history. I think I was deeply involved in this, collective defense stuff, and we all know, as a student of international politics and international law, we all know that each and every member of the United Nations has right not only to individual self-defense, but also to collective self-defense. But Japan has denied its right to collective self-defense just because of deeply embedded pacifism since 1945. But if you take a longer yardstick, Japan was on the side of Australia during the First World War, and Japan and Australia has been fighting together and working together since 1945. So throughout most of our modern history, except for this dark chapter during the Second World War, we've been working together, we've been struggling together. And this leads me to another point of how far we can go. And this involved collective self-defense stuff, involved not the change of provisions of Japanese Constitution, namely Article 9, but it involved the change of interpretation of Article 9, and under the strong initiative exercised by former Prime Minister Abe, I think we allowed for the partial exercise of Japan's right to collective defense. And I think one example is this: Japan's trying to protect Australian Navy vessels. So along with US Navy vessels, now legally speaking, we can protect Australian naval vessels whenever the conditions are met. I think this is one specific example of the closeness of our defense cooperation. So my short answer to you is legal framework has been greatly improved. So it's up to specific scenarios. So if we look at what's going to take place over Korean Peninsula, we are going to take a look at what's going to transpire across the Taiwan Strait. I think there are numerous opportunities for Australia and Japan to work, shoulder to shoulder and helping each other.
Excellent. Okay, well, we have one at the back. Thank you.
Ambassador Mon Matthews, ex-DFAT. You mentioned public opinion changing as a result of events in Ukraine and developments in South China and East China Seas. But one thing that we haven't discussed is South Korea and where that fits in Japan's strategic policy considerations. And as has been pointed out, if Australia can overcome memory and develop such a close relationship, do you see that happening with South Korea?
Please, Kersten.
I think Australia and Japan, United States, UK. I think South Korea shares basic values, democracy, respect for human rights, market economy, the rule of law, and hopefully they do share some of our strategic interests. At the same time, there is a room for further discussion on such issue as South China Sea, and Taiwan Strait. So with the new, advent of new government, we are looking to Seoul to, even more closely, work with us, work with Canberra, work with, Tokyo. In that regard, hopefully, this visit by, South Korean Foreign Minister to Tokyo is auspicious for, things to come in the near future.
Thank you. Tom, you wanted to?
Yeah, just a quick addition to that. Having talked to some analysts and policymakers recently in Washington, D.C., there seemed to be quite a lot of excitement there that this was an opportunity for a renewed attempt at trilateralism between Korea, Japan, and the United States, something that many DC think tankers and officials have been pressing for a long time. And of course, this has been very difficult in recent years for issues you're well aware of. But now that maybe the moment has arrived for this, to have another go at this, and this is a window of opportunity. And also, perhaps on I was talking to some Korean specialists as well, and they were also suggesting that Korea is starting to feel a little bit strategically isolated. It feels like it's been left behind a little bit by all of these developments, such as the Quad and AUKUS and everything, and maybe wants to get a little bit more re-engaged, whether that opens the way to Japan, US, Korea, trilateralism starting up again, a rapprochement with Tokyo, or whether it takes some other form of participating, either as a member or an affiliate of some of these burgeoning minilateral organizations like the Quad, or whatever grouping it might be, something like gosh, I've forgotten what the acronym is now, the Partnership for the Blue Pacific, PBP. Any of these things, we might see some more interest and some more opportunity for involvement from Seoul under current conditions. So I think that's something to watch with interest.
Thank you. Rikki, would you like to add anything on this? No? Okay. All right, look, I've realised that we are very close to coming up against time. There was one other question. Is it? Okay, look, I do invite you to talk to our panellists as we finish. We will have some drinks and some canapes. As we finish, I'd like to throw one last question at you all for a very quick response, but I think it's an interesting one. So your report really does go to the issue that there is an extension of competition beyond the military, the traditional military domains, and you mentioned space, cyber, and the electromagnetic spectrum. You talk about critical and emerging tech, and that potential for some of these things to really disrupt and reshape the strategic contours of the region. Again, I'm sorry to do this to you, but a quick answer from all of you. How well positioned are we as a partnership to respond to this and to work together in some of these newer areas? Mm-hmm. I'll start with you, please, Ambassador.
Well, and here, I think, bad tendency, on the part of civil servants, we always, look at ourselves, politicians and bureaucrats, and we neglect the importance of the private sector. But here I'd like to, emphasize the importance of the private sector. And when it comes to such issues as, Open RAN, biometrics, artificial intelligence, and quantum technology, Japanese companies are world leading. You name it, NAC, NTT, Fujitsu are always on the lookout for opportunities in Australia. So taking advantage of this, technological prowess on the part of Japanese, private companies, I think we can make a significant difference between Australia and Japan, even involving the United States. And this is something I keep on hearing from Aussies and Americans, Brits, in the context of AUKUS. Maybe not for nuclear-powered submarines, but when it comes to other issues like that, I mentioned, they expect the Japanese contributions, and we are more than ready to do, our contributions.
Excellent. Thank you. Rikki.
Well, I think this is an obvious cue about what should be included in the renewed joint security declaration. that there ought to be a clear statement of intent to involve relevant private sector entities in the joint enterprise of security. And this would mark out the new joint declaration as more than just a feel-good anniversary event. It would actually mean something then.
Wonderful, wonderful. Tom?
Yeah, I'll just echo a little bit that Japan has so much to offer in cooperation with Australia within these realms, and that the necessary legislation, the necessary agreements are in place for us to do it already. One thing that has been suggested to me by some of my interlocutors in Washington DC, both Japanese, I think, and Australians, was one of the issues that we face is developing standoff and strike capabilities. Whether or not there's some possibility, just absolutely, this has been floated, of joint missile co-development production. That might be something to think about, given the shortage of stockpiles that we all face. But a lot of these things will be within consortia, such as Japan's collaboration with the United Kingdom for its new FX fighter and so forth. So there's a lot of these things are happening. There's a lot of promise in this field to collaborate bilaterally or within larger consortia, whether it's public-private cooperation as well. That could be another ingredient in the mix.
Fabulous. Look, I apologise for my poor timekeeping, but please do take the opportunity to speak to our three panellists in the drinks afterwards, and please join me now in thanking them for their comments tonight.